Hello everybody, thank you for coming on by today, and this video topic was brought up by several of you in the comment section in a previous video about going over some of the old cover art for some classic Dragon Ball games, but I also thought I might include my thoughts on some newer ones. Now obviously there is a stack of Dragon Ball games that have been released over the decades, from the Famicom to the DS games to mobile games, and more often than not there would be an alternate cover if the game was localized. So I certainly won't be going over every single cover created, but mostly just the ones that stuck out to me for good or bad over each decade. And I'll just quickly bring this up again because I left it at the end of my last video, which I know everyone might not have watched considering it was a non-Dragon Ball video, but I'm currently writing a short manga one-shot, I guess, for the SMA audition. So all the time I usually have set to make videos, I'll be splitting in half for the next month, so content might be a bit delayed just depending on how things go. And I don't know if I'll do any topics that require a lot of research, like any new additions to the animated series. I was considering covering Nakatsuru or Tate next, but that might have to wait. But anyway, let's get to the featured artist today, which is Tommy's Drawings. This guy is only sitting at 40 followers. He has great work and some really dynamic poses, so go give him a follow. So let's start with the cover for the very first Dragon Ball game released in 1986 on the Super Cassette Vision, which I've never heard of before. It's well before my lifetime. But the first thing I appreciate about it is, for one, it isn't just repurposed art from the main series, at least from what I know of. But from a design aspect, I mean, it has a clear focal point, a quite saturated yellow and reddish orange tones are used, and as I've mentioned before, these colors especially grab the attention of your eye. He is also the closest to the camera, and the Kamehameha beam, as well as the missile, draws you in and around to Bulma and Oolong. So you have a bit of movement, the characters also look on model and are well drawn. And from a design standpoint, I will say that there is probably far too much text on the cover. It is quite noisy and cluttered, although I do like the fonts themselves. There are just too many font types used. Regardless, the most important information, which is the name of the game, is quite visible with a pink colored font with a red outline, as well as being the only serif font, making it stand out further, except for the serif font lettering here in the Dragon Ball logo. However, that is quite small, so it doesn't really detract. Although, interesting point is that Bulma is actually fighting and joining in on the battle, which she doesn't ever really do in the series, at least off the top of my head, except for hurling insults, or if she does get physical, it'd be slapping Master Roshi or shooting Goku. Furthermore, the axe does share some similarities to the Ox Kings, and on top of that, the car is almost identical to the same one we saw on the Journey to Fry Pan Mountain quite much earlier in the series. And I guess there's also the fact that they are fighting on the same arena floor from the Tenkaichi Budokai, with the enemies that they encounter from Muscle Tower in the middle of the countryside. So there's that. Although minor nitpick, perhaps some speed lines could have been added to the axe just to add a bit of motion, but I mean, overall it doesn't really matter. And if you want to know more about this game, I recommend this great little video, very well edited and presented with only about 2k views, by someone called PowerKeg Greg. I'll leave a link in the description to his video and channel. Now for the rest of the Dragon Ball games released in the 80s, a lot of the art was reused, or it was reused poses from the main series, so nothing too interesting. Although my favorite from this decade was probably the first one I showed, and this one, even though it is repurposed art, it is still good nevertheless. But I thought it was worth bringing up that there was a localization of one of these games, in particular Dragon Ball Shenlong no Nazu in North America in 1988, and they completely changed the cover to this. More so, I found it interesting that they changed Goku's design into basically Sun Wukong, which Goku of course is based off. And Goku also took on a similar design in the early drafts. For the localization, they also changed Bulma's name to Nora, the Dragon Balls were renamed Crystal Balls, and Yamcha was renamed Lancer. Quite an interesting topic within itself. Although back to the original game, the cover art on a second glance was actually decent. It has a unique border, and I like the composition of the surrounding characters running in the same motion of the dragon. Although once again, can't say for sure if these are reused poses and art. But I actually found some of the other art this game shipped with to be a bit more interesting, in particular this piece. For one, it isn't reused art this time, which I appreciate, and it's also cool getting to see the whole gang together enjoying the game. The colors are gorgeous, a lot of vibrant tones in this piece, although the only problem is the fact that Goku is actually looking at the side of the TV instead of the screen. I mean, Oolong is like the only one that seems to be seeing anything, but I am guessing that it was a deliberate way to show a clear shot of the characters and the TV at the same time, just to be a bit more interesting. And one minor nitpick is that Oolong is drawn on a different plane than the other characters, so the perspective does look a little strange for him. But anyway, now onto the 90s. So for the first few games, it's just reused poses. Nothing that impressive. But then we get to Dragon Ball Z Legend of the Super Saiyan, and originally I was going to praise this design for how well Goku's drawn and how it looks really close to Toriyama's work, but I had an uncanny feeling I had seen it somewhere before, and I did actually find the source image, and I realized quickly why it looks so close to Toriyama's style, and that is because it is traced. So there isn't really anything that special about it, although there is this cool paintbrush type effect in the back, and you have Frieza peering in. A simple but nice touch. Although the Frieza piece is reused again, and the style looks completely different and of lower quality to the Goku piece. So overall, this game cover does look nice, but it doesn't really hold a lot of originality to it. But onto one of my favorites from this decade, which is the first Dragon Ball Z Butoden, or Dragon Ball Z Super Fighting Story, released in 1993. And although a simple piece, I just love how good Cell looks and the angle, but also how the base tone for Cell comes to form a shadow underneath Goku. I thought that was very smooth, and Goku also looks great. Not particularly different or dynamic, but still a great piece. And for the second game, it's a similar thing again, simple composition, but the art is great. Goku really has a manga feel with the sharper line work, and the color placement really defines the planes of the face so well. And I really can't get enough of these orangey and pinkish skin tones used for Goku and Gohan in this era. And finally, the blue background really gives a nice, calm and tranquil feel to the piece. Overall, a really simple but clean design, and although I don't know the artist's name, he also seems to have done a lot of promo work for the main series. You can usually tell his work by those thin eyebrows and quite wide pupils. Up next, we have a cover for Dragon Ball Z Hyper Dimension, released in 1996, and man, Vegito looks good, but the reason I included this one was because Goku and Vegeta are just perfect. Although I know a lot of fans like the more chunky and fluffy look of the classic Super Saiyan hair, which I do too, but I also really love the more sleek and spiky look we get with SSJ2, and although I don't know the artist again, he really does channel a lot of aspects of Toriyama's artwork in the Buu arc, with a more refined and mature look to the characters' faces. Then my favourite of all from this decade by Tadayoshi Yamamoru himself. For one, it's not a reused poses, and the poses themselves are great. His take on Goku and Gohan feel very compact and refined, but my favourite of all is his Frieza. He captures that smug look to him perfectly. Furthermore, the angle of Frieza having him look down further gives a menacing look. And also, like I've said before, I love his style of shading. Very clean and with great shape language. Additionally, he uses a lot of pen strokes under Frieza's chin and around various muscle groups, and it kind of carries a sort of manga spirit to it. And at the same time, it still gives a bit of roughness to the designs. And finally, I just love the yellow backdrop. It adds a energetic feel to this piece. And on a side note, it's actually the only reason I was fine with that really basic cover we got for Cyberpunk. I don't know, I just really like yellow backdrops. Now, I was going to skip over this one because it was quite a simple design of just Goku and, you know, that's it really. Final Bout is quite a well-known one, and I'll probably get someone asking why I didn't cover it in the comment sections. So, I mean, the first thing I appreciate is the style of shading and even the colors themselves. And I know not everyone likes tan GT Goku and all the highlights, but it is often overlooked that this look is really faithful to Toriyama's own illustrations. Not saying I prefer it over the colors we saw in Z, but in this instance, I can appreciate it, and it is executed really well, looking just like a Toriyama illustration. Furthermore, GT to me always had a more round and wider look to the faces, whereas this for me heralds back to Z's more angular look, which I do prefer once again, and of course is also very reminiscent of Toriyama's style, and so I'm guessing this was done by Nikatsuru, especially when looking at the ears and the eyes. It really does look like him, and he was always good at replicating Toriyama's style, so I'm pretty certain that he drew this cover. So anyway, now to get to some of my least favorite from the 90s with these two, both from the series Dragon Ball Z Goku Hishoden and Dragon Ball Z Goku Gekitoden, with the first game releasing in 94 and then the next one in 95 on exclusively the Game Boy. And the reason is that it's not that the artwork itself is bad, but it's just because it's artwork ripped directly from the main series with no changes. It's not even a redraw where like they reused a pose. It just feels, you know, lazy and uninspiring. Although at least they used Masaki Sato's Goku and Frieza, so I guess that is a bonus to this one. And the third one, like the last one, it kind of feels cheap again, and it's just more reused images. I know the one on the right is from a poster, and looking at Kid Goku, it looks like it was reused from a previous poster back from early Dragon Ball, which is part of the main problem, that there is two completely different art styles drawn by two different artists. Like, you have this really sharp and blocky take on Goku from the Buu arc, and then you have this more rounded look from early Dragon Ball. It just doesn't really blend that well together, I think, on a poster. A better alternative would have been what they went with in the game menu, which is a bit more of a angular and slightly refined take on Kid Goku. So when you put the two side by side, they just, blend better. And lastly, it is the background. Now, the background itself is actually great. You have a lot of these thick brushstrokes with lightning in the back. It looks quite abstract and gives a dark feel, which again isn't bad, but it just doesn't go with like this happy Kid Goku on the poster. And perhaps if it was used as a backdrop for that Yamamoru poster with Frieza, I think it would suit much better. Anyway, onto the 2000s. Now, the thing for console releases, there are North American localizations for every game, unlike the previous decade, where a lot of the releases were exclusive to Japan, and quite often the cover art would be changed. Then on top of that, you would have handheld console games pick up dramatically compared to the last game, where you only had about 2 releases. Now there is a new one every year from basically 2002 onward. And again, a lot of these are localized in North America, so you have even more alternate covers. So to put it simply, you have almost up to around 40 to 50 different covers, perhaps more, and that's not including the mobile games. So it's just ridiculous how many different covers there are. So forgive me if I miss a really great one or don't bring up a terrible one. But the highlight of this decade is definitely the cover art for Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi. And it's such a unique take on the original shot of Goku when he goes Super Saiyan. The style of shading and the colors themselves are just like you would see in Toriyama's illustrations. And kind of similar to before, I enjoy seeing the more spiky look to the Super Saiyan hairstyle. I can't deny how cool it looks. And once again, it seems he takes a note from Toriyama's approach on the Super Saiyan form in the Buu arc, as well as the line work for the hair looking very sharp. And when you take the aura away, you can get a better look at how detailed he has gone with the hair. So in the end, you have a design that takes a lot of inspiration from Toriyama, but also feels clean and modern. And with his cover for the second game, Nekatsu again really captures that more mature look to Goku perfectly, which was a staple of Goku's design in later arcs with the larger chin and a more softer and refined jawline. And he draws quite a dynamic Kid Buu in the background, although I don't really go for the skin tones too much, especially when compared to the warmer orange and pink tones used a lot in Z. And even the colors for the hair feel quite dull when put side to side, but overall, still a great piece. Although, interesting note is that in the anime, Buu actually had 5 fingers, whereas in the manga he had 2, and Nekatsu surprisingly goes with the manga version here. And furthermore, with the American version, it is actually somewhat faithful to this design, with 3 characters in the middle, and then Kid Buu is in the background, which was a pleasant surprise because generally they just changed the covers completely, like in the last game. And for once, the repurposed art in particular of Gotenks, Vegito, and Goku's actually seems to be grabbed from the same artist or an artist with a similar style, so you don't have a huge variation of different styles within the same picture, which is a bit of a problem we will soon discuss in some of my least favorite of this decade. And well, to top it off, the American version actually has a holographic cover, which does look amazing. So even though it's a pity they couldn't have used Nekatsu's original art, it's still actually a decent cover regardless. And lastly, my final favorite of the 2000s. Now this one is probably one of the strangest out of all of these. First off, it was released on the Wonder Swan, a obscure handheld console which had a very short lifespan and was an exclusive console just to Japan. And so contrary to all the other games released on consoles in this decade, this would be an exclusive release to Japan. It also had the lowest sales out of any Dragon Ball game, selling only 9,000 units. Furthermore, the art style is so incredibly faithful in every single aspect to Dragon Ball's art style in the 80s, with the eyes, the clothing, the anatomy, the colors especially are 100% correct for every character, and even down to the other details like a lot of pen strokes under the eyebrows. Now the thing is, I've never seen this poster outside of this cover, and as much as repurposing is done with these game covers, they never, at least from what I've seen, reuse an entire poster, so I don't believe it's actually a old reused promo poster. So my first guess is that this poster was originally designed for a discontinued game back in the 80s, and so it never saw the light of day, or it's because it is a heavily traced piece, thus why the artist was able to capture this time period so well. Although again, the colors are really accurate and don't feel like they were applied digitally, but it, just might be the texture throwing me off. But regardless, it's quite an interesting piece within itself. Because also when it comes to reused art, as we've said, it usually can feel a bit random, but the composition for this one is actually great. You have a good sense of a hierarchy illustrated by the angle and the scale the characters are drawn at. For example, you have Tao and Commander Red side to side, in positions somewhat higher looking down, kind of representing their supposed superiority. Tien is appropriately placed in the middle of these two, a somewhat neutral zone as he was both a villain and reformed his ways. And then you have King Piccolo and Piccolo Jr. right in the back, which are drawn the largest, giving the sense that these two are the biggest looming threat over our heroes. Now to bring up some of my least favorite art of this decade, and there were a lot that gave me mixed feelings, as the art style for Dragon Ball games has now moved a lot to these plastic and dull tones, but the first one would be for Dragon Ball Z Shin Budokai for the PSP in 2006, and the base drawings themselves are okay at best. The facial expressions for Broly and Gogeta especially feel stiff, although Piccolo is fine, but perhaps with Broly, for example, if they made the eyes and the creases under the eyes actually curve instead of being almost straight lines, it would dramatically help. The line weight is especially poor. There is next to no variation in the width, and so you don't really get a sense of depth at all. The shading also looks like it was done with Adobe Illustrator or something, because you just have these really sharp triangular shapes which don't curve or wrap around the muscle groups on the face, so you get really stiff facial expressions. And there is also way too many fonts used. We have up to 4 here, when 2 would be absolutely plenty. And then the next one feels like a fan-made poster on DeviantArt, because it's just all over the place with all this repurposed art. So in the end, you have a culmination of various art styles, like this piece of Piccolo, which looks like it was taken from the Saiyan arc, then just recolored and vectorized. And then this piece of Goku, which is quite a detailed take and looks the most different in style to the rest, especially with the style of shading. And to top it off within itself, it was a reused pose from a Yamamoru poster, which was a reused pose from a Toriyama piece. Goku and Vegeta are also scaled quite small as well, and overall, it just doesn't feel organic in any way. Now, this was the American cover for the localized version, but honestly, the Japanese version might not feel like a fan-made cover, but it still is very poorly done. Once again, it's just a redraw, but lacks any qualities of the original. The characters are thinner, and the anatomy looks out of proportion. The coloring style adds a stiff feel and doesn't accentuate the form, and characters like Gohan especially have a more wider and rounder face rather than the more sleek and angular look of Toriyama's work. Although one positive is that there are vibrant tones, especially for the clothing, but that's about it. Now, I also found out that some of the EU releases seem to have changed the covers as well, and in one case used the in-game models, which honestly isn't an outright bad idea probably at the time, but it definitely doesn't age well in the long run. Now on to the 2010s. So in this decade, the whole changing covers for localization seems to have stopped, and at the same time, redrawing poses from previous posters also seems to be limited now. However, the style has completely moved over to Yamamoru's look, which is a step down, but still the cover for Xenoverse 2 is probably my favorite of this decade, and even though yes, the design does come off stiff, especially with the hair, but the use of black tones and the shading out of his face is what sells it for me. It carries a mysterious and powerful look. Furthermore, I like how you have a silhouette of Goku with his son, future Gohan, and his father Bardock in the background. It adds depth, and it's like the cover is almost telling a story, which is something very few covers have done. The background also appears like a concrete wall texture, giving this piece some grit. And you also have Shenron cleverly added in the logo. So overall, unlike many pieces I've seen so far, it actually does have a strong essence of originality to it. And now on to my second favorite. I was actually thinking about going with the Dragon Ball Legends cover art, but I mean, technically it doesn't have a physical game cover, so I decided to go with the Dragon Ball FighterZ cover. And I mean, that game has become a massive hit in the franchise, so I think it deserves a mention. So getting my one main negative out of the way is that it perhaps was a little too simple with just one character, but I mean, besides that, it carries a lot of intensity with Goku shooting right at the viewer, and this was one of the rare cases from this decade that I really like the colors. For once, they are vibrant. The skin tones aren't these drab plastic tones, and their hair has this bright yellow with some orange tones, giving it a golden shine, and the tones also contrast. The coloring style itself is quite unique to all the others we have seen, with a watercolor-like brush, giving a traditional feel and moving further away from that flat and unorganic vectorized look that has been so prevalent in this decade especially. The traditional aesthetic continues on with the line work, reminding me a lot of a brush pen with some gorgeous thick line work, and a lot of variation, further creating depth. And there was another small addition that gave this a traditional feel that can go quite unnoticed. You can notice that the line work actually changes to a deep, desaturated version of said color it is paired next to. For example, on the skin, the pen strokes become this deep grayish brown. In other areas of blue clothing, it becomes a deep blue, and then with the hair, it sort of becomes this orangish brown. This somewhat simulates the effect you would get with a traditional brush, as it usually soaks into the canvas. It kind of blends with the pigment that's already on the page, which gives you this effect. And surprisingly, the style itself actually takes a note from the old school designs, like with the side of the head being more narrow and curving in rather than the more straight and boxy look, and the hair looking less like Lego, as I've heard it referred to as. And on closer look, I'm guessing this was drawn perhaps by Fenyo. Then finally, to top it off, you had these massive brush strokes going around Goku in a spiral motion, looking really spectacular. And I also forgot to mention the speed lines added, really increasing the grit and intensity to this piece. But then again, actually now looking at this piece closely, I think this might have taken my #1 spot for this decade. Now for my least favorite of this decade, it's kind of hard to decide because, well, what holds many pieces back isn't poor localizations or reused posters or even bad composition, I think. It's more so that they are just mediocre art styles within themselves, which kind of drags everything else down. For example, if this cover art for Dragon Ball Heroes Ultimate Mission had the more angular and sharper art style of Z, and with colors that aren't so desaturated, I think it would dramatically increase the overall appeal to quite a simple piece. But I guess if I had to go with any, it would be from Dragon Ball Z Tenkaichi Tag Team. The proportions for Vegeta's arm especially look off, the poses feel stiff, and once again the characters like Gohan lack that angular look to the face, which for me always made them look far more cooler. And on closer inspection, it does seem the hair is quite off model as well. And I guess while we're on that, talking about hair, it has next to no flow and looks incredibly stiff. The line weight is also poor, with what it seems the same width brush used throughout most of it, with the brush not even tapering off in some parts. Although at least the artist didn't redraw any posters from an old poster, and the colors are quite vibrant, so I'll give it that. Now onto the 2020s. Man, that sounds futuristic saying that. Thankfully, we only have one cover to go over because this video has gotten quite long now, and this one actually stirred up quite a bit of controversy when it released for kind of how plain it looked. Now for some channel lore. When this cover first dropped, I actually planned to do a video where I come up with an alternate cover and do a redraw, but it turns out that totally not Mark read my mind, and so I couldn't do it because I knew I'd just get called out for being a copy, so I scrapped that idea and that video never came to be. But anyway, what's my thoughts on it? Well, when I first saw it, I think I was like, oh, is this it? But in all honesty, I think it's one of the few times ever where I actually don't mind a modern Yamamura inspired Goku in regards to the base drawing. A quite rare occurrence, but having a closer look, it is incredibly clean and polished. The colors are quite vibrant with some nice warm tones for the shading, and there is also a smooth gradient. The base drawing itself is also well proportioned, and we get Goku riding the Nimbus, and finally, I really like the red background. But in all honesty, I mean, if they just compose some simple shots even behind Goku from when he was growing up, like a lot of the posters we have seen in the past, it would have dramatically improved the overall composition and interest. But anyway, with that, I'll leave it there and we'll end this video. Thank you for watching to the end if you made it this far. And if I had to go with my all-time favorite piece, I think out of all of these, it would have to be between the two covers Nakatsuru did and that Vegito and Yamamura piece. To be honest, I think I'm tempted to go with the Vegito one as my all-time favorite. But anyway, let me know which one was your favorites in the comments. But with that, hope to see you in the next video.